What up, YouTube? This is your boy, Adam of NOLA, and this is my channel, Skepticism. We're starting a new series today, so if you're watching this video first in this series, congratulations, you're coming along for the ride. This series is called GotAnswers. That may seem like a fairly simplistic title or for a YouTube series, but the idea of GotAnswers is very simple. If you've ever Googled any big questions about the Bible or Christianity in general, there's a really good chance that one of the first entries that you receive back in the search results is from Got Questions. If you ask about what does the Bible say about homosexuality, if you talk about or ask about what does the Bible, what prophecies were fulfilled by Jesus in the Bible? And on, so many times, one of the first answers that you'll see in your search results will be from gotquestions.org. Gotquestions.org, it's certainly not the worst apologetics site I've ever seen by far. They do seem sometimes to be sort of balanced. I'm not going to say fair and balanced. That's been tarnished forever. But they seem fair at times. But that being said, there's still a strong apologist theme that comes through in a lot of their articles. So I thought that it would be really great to use them as a basis for a series where basically we read through their question, we read through their answer, and then I give you what I would consider to be the real answer. I know that's arrogant, but at a minimum, it is an answer from an atheist perspective. Because not that all of my answers are right, but all of Got Questions' answers are not right either. And I think that it is useful to go through those questions and see a lot of the common things that Christians bring up as lame defenses for their viewpoints, as sad defenses for their twisted view of historicity, etc. So that's why I'm going to be using this. This isn't necessarily to pick on gotquestions.org. Like I said, it's in terms of apologetics, they are pretty far down the list of places that really bother me. Instead, I think that gotquestions.org is a great example of kind of generic answers that Christians will tend to spit back at you when you talk about issues of faith and dogma, etc. So also, it's convenient to go through Got Questions because they have thousands of articles. They even have a random feature. So that's what we're going to be doing in this series. I won't normally do this whole preamble with the series, but since this is the first in the series, I figured I'd let you know what we're actually doing with GotAnswers. So, with that being said, let's get into our first question from gotquestions.org. And this question is, what does it mean to have the fear of God? I like this question. I'm glad that this question is on here because I'll say before I even get into their response, their answer, that when I was growing up, this was an interesting question to me. It was one that came up in my mind on more than one occasion. You'd hear many people who are faithful, devout, they will talk about the fear of God. And yet the way that I was raised in my household and our flavor of Christianity, we very much received the word that God is an all-loving God. God loves us and wants us to be happy. He loved us so much that he, say it with me, sent his only begotten Son, that whoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. This is what we were taught. We were given this image of a benevolent God. It probably doesn't surprise you then to find out we spent very little time reading the Old Testament. We spent even very little time dissecting some of the harsher books and verses in the New Testament. It was very much a gospel-centric, God is love, God is peace, God is happiness kind of message. So, back to the original question then, since so many people do talk about the fear of God, it's reasonable to ask, well, then what do we mean when we say that? What does it mean to have the fear of God? Well, starting into Got Questions Answer, it says, and I quote, "For the unbeliever, the fear of God is the fear of the judgment of God and eternal death, which is eternal separation from God." Right away. I don't actually know why they felt the need to even start from this perspective. Let's be frank. GotQuestions.org, it is a site by Christians for Christians. Sure, with their massive search engine ranking, they will come up in the searches even of those who aren't Christians, obviously. But their stuff is written really much from a deeply Christian perspective, and it's really written for other Christians as you go through this stuff. So I'm not sure why they even felt the need to start off with this rhetorical quagmire, which is trying to say what the unbeliever sees the fear of God as being. I don't think that anyone at GotQuestions.org or anyone contributing these articles is even qualified on the most basic level to tell you what an unbeliever thinks, because presumably they're all believers. So I don't know why they felt the need to start from this perspective, but it is silly and comical that they start with this sentence. I'm going to read it again. "For the unbeliever, the fear of God is the fear of the judgment of God and eternal death, which is eternal separation from God." So let me get this straight. I don't believe in God, which I don't. I am an unbeliever. But you think that for me, the fear of God is fear of the judgment of the same God. Remember, that's the God that I don't believe in. But you think that in my mind, the fear of God is the fear of judgment of this non-existent God. Okay. This is like saying that for those of you out there who don't believe in Santa, the fear of Santa is the fear of the judgment of Santa. What? I'm laughing about it, but this is really indicative of a very sad viewpoint that many Christians take, whereby the world revolves around them and their beliefs. Even in those rare moments when they feel compelled for some reason to speak about atheists or agnostics or those from other religions, and they want to talk about what those other people think or believe, they can only think about it from the perspective of someone who is already a believer. I don't know if, for some people, I think it's willful ignorance, but for some it's just that they are so ensconced in their own Christian-centric worldview that they can't even imagine a world in which, no, to me, fear of God is not fear of the judgment of God, because I don't believe in God. So the concept of fear of God, to me, can't possibly be fearing the judgment of the God that I don't believe exists. But Christians do this over and over again. And we see this, for example, in the U.S., because they'll there's this myth that it's that the country was founded for religious freedom, and unfortunately that's getting eroded year by year and day by day in this country. They will go through and they'll say, "Oh, we want to have the Ten Commandments posted in the schools of every public school classroom," and then they'll swear to you that this is not Christian-centric. But if you say to them, "But I want some central tenets from the Quran posted in every classroom," they will scream bloody murder. If you say that I want some of the most sacred parts of the Bhagavad Gita posted in every classroom. They will, again, lose their shit. But they see no problem whatsoever with saying, but these things should be posted, these Christian ideals should be posted in the classroom. And they will want to talk about other, like young earth creationism, which is a Christian or Judeo-Christian viewpoint. It does not align with the creation ideas of other religions, but they want this creationism to be taught alongside evolution as though they are even vaguely equivalent when they clearly are not. So again, I don't know why they decided to start. The rest of the question, it's not a great answer, but the rest of the answer at least is not so bad as to trying to tell an atheist that you think the fear of God is the fear of the judgment of God. No, I don't think your God exists. So that's silly. One more thing I want to point out here before we move on or continue with their answer is that there are times when they will put biblical, references, chapters and verse in, well, they do this in almost all of their answers, as you'd imagine. But as so often happens when I see these references put in to any site where they're trying to make a Christian argument, a lot of times they'll put in these verses that by themselves are kind of a fail. So let me give you an example of this. They're trying to make the case that for the unbeliever, the fear of God is the fear of the judgment of God and eternal death. And then they reference Luke chapter 12, verse 5. Well, what does that say? It says, "But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him." So in other words, I don't believe in God, but you're telling me that I fear God and I fear the judgment of God because of something that's written in your holy text. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense, totally. And then they also mention Hebrews 10:31. So let's see what wonderful wisdom that gives us. Hebrews 10:31 is, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." Again, this is your Bible telling us that it is fearful to be in the hands of your living God when you are trying to use this as a basis to back up the idea that atheists fear the judgment of God. That makes no damn sense. Okay, enough of that. We will continue on with the answer that is given for what does it mean to have the fear of God. For the believer, the fear of God is something much different. The believer's fear is reverence of God. Now, I've seen this over and over again. The Bible uses the word fear. It doesn't only use fear in reference to God, but it uses fear repeatedly. And, of course, in sermons and such, Christians even use this phrase, the fear of God. And yet, when you ask them about it, they'll say something like this, that for the believer, the fear of God is something much different. The believer's fear is reverence of God. So fear equals reverence. That literally makes no sense. I do understand that if you revere someone or something, you could have a kind of low-key fear of what that thing is capable of. So I'm not saying that there is no possible connection between fear and reverence. Although, in my humble opinion, the connection is very weak. Because if something is so powerful that I fear it, I don't revere it. I might fear it, like I fear the nuclear power of Russia, deciding to hit the button, push the magical all war button. That doesn't mean that I revere Russia. I don't revere Russia at all, but I think that anyone in the global climate has to fear what happens if Russia decides to send the nukes. And in case I sound terribly ethnocentric there, I think that every country also should fear what happens if the U.S. does the same. Okay, so my point is that fear the idea that fear is reverence, or that when Christians speak of fear that it's only reverence, is quite frankly a massive stretch and doesn't make much sense. And the Bible is chock full of legitimate reasons to outright fear God. And yes, that is even for the believers. That's not just for those who don't believe. I mean, there are all sorts of places in the Bible where God is just jerking around his own believers. I mean, there's the whole book of Job, which is one of the sickest books in the whole Bible, where he just makes his life hell to prove a point with Satan. But even if you want to think of Job as being poetry or something, that's fine. You don't have to go that far. Going back much farther in the narrative, when Aaron's sons offered unholy fire to the Lord, which it never says what that even means, but presumably they screwed up a ritual, God burned them to death. When people had the nerve to actually speak out against Moses, or speak out against God. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said Moses, because I'm conflating two different things in my mind. When they had the nerve to actually create a golden calf, God sent a plague on them. When they had the nerve to actually complain that they didn't have everything that they needed, God said, fine, you're going to spend the rest of your life in the desert. Only your offspring will make it to the promised land. The point is that over and over and over again, whether you are a believer or not, it is shown very much that, yeah, you really should fear God because he's an ass. But this fear equals reverence shtick is unfortunately a common trope amongst believers, that when they say that they have a fear of God, what they really mean is reverence. But those words don't mean the same thing. And while I can understand a certain connection at times between those two concepts, it is really weak to imply that a believer's fear of God is reverence of God, because their answer says the believer's fear is reverence of God. And I'm sorry, that's just not supported at all in the text. Then the answer says Hebrews chapter 12 verses 28 through 29 is a good description of this. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful, and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Put a pin in that a second. First of all, I'm going to look at that exact Hebrews reference, because this is a little bit of a weak reference for them to pull out here. And like I said, at times here I will pull these out. It says, "Let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire." And it's saying that this is supposedly a reference from the Bible that says reverence, and it does actually say reverence, but it also says God is a consuming fire, which doesn't sound like reverence. That sounds like fear. And if you don't think that he's a consuming fire, you can look at the times in the Bible when God literally burned his own people. Yes, there are multiple times in the Bible where God literally burns his own people. So the idea that this is somehow just a backing up of the idea that this is fear equals reverence just doesn't wash. Back to Got Questions Answer. It says, this reverence and awe are exactly what the fear of God means for Christians. This is the motivating factor for us to surrender to the creator of the universe. I want to point out here, Christians have no problem at all interchanging fear and reverence. And this is the posture of someone who's on the receiving end of an abusive relationship. There's a sick joke I've made before, like if my wife accidentally hits me out, I'll say abuse equals love, abuse equals love. But that's, of course, a sick joke, because unfortunately there are people in abusive relationships who have to tell themselves that literally or figuratively in their head every time they deal with this abuse. And yet this is exactly what this answer is telling us to do. That we need to take this fear of God and use it as a motivating factor for us to surrender to the creator of the universe. Proverbs 1 verse 7 declares, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." Until we understand who God is and develop a reverential fear of him, we cannot have true wisdom. True wisdom comes only from understanding who God is and that he is holy, just, and righteous. The whole idea that God is needed for wisdom or knowledge is sad and laughable. It's even sillier to think that that fear is required for knowledge or wisdom. I mean, all you have to do to disavow this ridiculous notion is ask yourself, in a culture, if you were to plop down into a culture that had never heard of Judaism or Christianity, are you going to tell me that no one in that culture has any knowledge and no one in that culture has any wisdom? There's not a single wise man or woman in the entire civilization, even if it's 1 billion people in this culture. If they have not heard the word of your God, you think that they cannot have knowledge or wisdom. I mean, of course, the knowledge one is outright laughable because knowledge is just learning anything. But even if we said, okay, but wisdom is knowing the ways of the world and knowing how to make good decisions, and maybe your wisdom comes from what you have extracted from the Bible. And if that is true, first, I congratulate you on pulling wisdom out of a really disgusting book, but good for you. I'm glad that you've gotten something of meaning out of it. But the idea that there was never a wise man in a society until that society was first exposed to the Judeo-Christian God is ethnocentric and bigoted and disgusting. This also illustrates, and I'll say again too, and then the idea that you need fear in order to get that knowledge or wisdom. Oh gosh, that's so gross. This also illustrates how a common trope that Christians do all the time, all right? Which is that they paint God as the necessary first step to anything, all right? You want to have wisdom. Well, you need to have God. You want to be wealthy and successful. Well, you definitely need to have God. You want to have happiness in your life. Well, you can't do that without God. You want to have love, be in love with anyone. Well, you can't truly do that without God. Anything that humans desire and anything that we see as generally good and something we want to work towards, Christians will be happy to seize upon it and tell you definitively that you can't ultimately get any of it without God. Okay. Moving on with Got Questions Answer. Deuteronomy 10 verse 12 and 20 Deuteronomy 10 verse 12 and 20 through 21 records, "And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul? Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. He is your praise. He is your God, who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your own eyes. The fear of God is the basis for our walking in his ways, serving him, and yes, loving him." This is so much ick, really. Because the idea that you would require in a single breath both fear and love is revolting. And even if you told me that, okay, but this is appropriate for God, this is a model that people use for their lives. This is a model that gets literally brainwashed into them from birth in many families, okay? If you were born into a Christian household, then you were raised in a Christian household. You were raised with these ideas from birth. And I'm not saying that if the Bible didn't exist that we wouldn't have abusive relationships or that we wouldn't have, people taking advantage of each other. But when this is the model that is given to you, this is the model of love, where it's telling you, fear him, serve him, love him, and it's all just swirled up into one big flurry. That is deeply problematic. Some redefine the fear of God for believers to respecting him. While respect is definitely included in the concept of fearing God, there is more to it than that. A biblical fear of God for the believer includes understanding how much God hates sin and fearing his judgment on sin, even in the life of a believer. This highlights that the Christian view of God is ultimately infantilizing. It's a constant bargain of a carrot and a stick. It's that, if you fear God and you revere him and all this, you're going to go to heaven. If not, you're going to get punished. Whether that's hell or just outright punishment of some sort, whatever, you're going to get punishment. And that may sound de rigueur for the average Christian, but where else in our lives do we cling to this juvenile worldview? Now, I love my parents. There was a time when I used to fear their punishment, but I don't walk around today fearing their punishment, nor should I. I mean, if they're not happy with something I'm doing, they certainly may talk to me about it. They may counsel me, but I'm a grown-ass man. And that I know that the Christians will hear that and they'll think, oh, the hubris in you. See, that's why, you're not with God. Well, that's not why I'm not with God. But yeah, it is hubris because I'm not suckling at the teat of God for the rest of my life. There comes a point when you have to grow the hell up and take responsibility for your own actions and do it without the fear of the magic sky daddy punishing you. Because that's ultimately what we're talking about, is that if you need the idea that a magic sky daddy is hanging over you at all times punishing you, that's kind of sad. Hebrews 12 verses 5 through 11 describes God's discipline of the believer. While it is done in love, Hebrews 12:6, it is still a fearful thing. Oh yes, please discipline me, God. Notice, now, they tried to start out with these misdirections, right? Where they were like, oh, fear is really about reverence or respect. But now they've essentially they've regressed. They've gone full bore and said, yeah, but it's really about fear. Which, shockingly enough, what this comes down to is fear equals, wait for it, fear. That God rules through fear. He rules his own. He doesn't just rule over the non-believers and punish the people that don't follow him. No, he rules his own people by fear. That is the Christian ideal. And even though they start with this idea of reverence and they've tried to lean into that, even in their own answer, they can't bring it in themselves to not go back to this idea that if you don't do right, God's gonna punish you. He's going to teach you a lesson. That's right. He's going to teach you a lesson. You're going to learn. You're going to get right with God. Or else. That's what they ultimately come down to. It says, when we were children, our fear of discipline from our parents no doubt prevented some evil actions on our part. The same should be true in our relationship with God. No, it shouldn't. We should fear his discipline and therefore seek to live our lives in a way that pleases him. This represents such a stunted idea of morality. It's based on essentially emotional immaturity. And let me tell you why. Because the idea here is that you'll do right because you're afraid that God will punish you. And it's okay at a certain point in your emotional, intellectual, and I'll say it, spiritual development to have that viewpoint. At some point, you got to grow the hell up. At some point, you finally have to say to yourself, you know what? I'm going to do what's right because it's the right thing. And I'm going to avoid the things that are wrong because they're the wrong thing. Not because God told me, not because I fear the punishment of God, but just because this is the right thing to do. That is a sense of, that is when you've achieved moral maturity. And this model of where we are children that should fear the discipline of God. We should fear his discipline and therefore seek to live our lives in a way that pleases him. That is an infantile model of morality. It says believers are not to be scared of God. We have no reason to be scared of him. Everything prior to this goes entirely against this point. Not only did the verses that they brought up lay this out, but if you get into the Bible, it will give you much more explicit examples of, oh yeah, you should be afraid of him because he'll kill you on an instant. God was going to kill Moses because he found out at some point. Why he didn't know this originally, I don't know, because he's omniscient. Yeah, right. But he found out after he gave Moses the plan that he was going to use Moses to get the Israelites out of Egypt. Then somehow he found out that Moses had an uncircumcised son. And then in one of the strangest chapters and verses in the whole Bible, he just out of nowhere comes down and says he was about to kill him. If that doesn't scare you as someone who believes in this cretin, it should. It really should. And it says we have his promise that nothing can separate us from his love. This just plays into the standard Christian rhetorical trap that if you ever, I'm sorry, I should also mention it calls up Romans here. Romans 8, verses 38 to 39. I'm going to read this here first because I think this is important. Romans 8, 38 to 39 says, "For I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present nor things to come, nor powers, nor height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord." That sounds wonderful, doesn't it? But here's where that actually doesn't sound so wonderful, because essentially what this plays into then is if you ever have doubts, if you ever, God forbid, leave the faith, or if you have ever have serious doubts about the faith, all it means is that then they pull out the same old tired Christian rhetorical trap that says, well, you were never a believer in the first place. You were never a Christian in the first place. So that's their way of saying that no matter what happens, even though the Bible shows that people can be burnt to death and drowned and all this other stuff, even though they are believers of his, the fact is that, you don't have anything to fear because nothing bad will happen to you. According to Romans, you will never be separated from his love, except if you are. And then we'll just say, you were never really Christian to begin with. Yeah, sorry about that. You weren't really in the tribe. Finally, their answer says, we have his promise that he will never leave us or forsake us. Fearing God means having a reverence for him that greatly impacts the way we live. The fear of God is respecting him, obeying him, submitting to his discipline, and worshiping him in awe. There's a really much simpler way to put this. A fear of God means fear. Fear means fear. And when I was growing up, I like to believe that that's not what it really meant. But if you read the Bible, yes, it does. It means fear. So this has been the introductory episode of Got Answers that is cribbed off of the apologetic claptrap that we get from gotquestions.org. So thank you for joining us. And we will be on again with another great question from getquestions.org. Thank you.